He was the general who famously lost more battles than he won. He led a starving, half-beaten army of farmers and merchants against the most powerful military on the planet. And yet we remember him as one of the greatest leaders in history, the indispensable man who built a nation. This is the story of how George Washington, the struggling commander, a man plagued by self-doubt and tactical mistakes, was forged in the crucible of war to become a battlefield visionary and the legendary first president of the United States. How do you lead a revolution when you can barely keep your own army from falling apart? How do you inspire hope when you're facing almost certain defeat? The answer isn't a perfect record, but a relentless drive to learn, to adapt, and to simply endure. This is a story about failure, resilience, and the unlikely victory that created America. Before he was the face on the dollar bill, George Washington was a young, ambitious, and often frustrated military officer. His public life didn't start with glory. It started with a spark that ignited a global conflict. In 1754, as a young major in the Virginia militia, Washington was sent to the Ohio River Valley to challenge French expansion. In a murky skirmish, Washington's men got into a fight with a French scouting party, and its commander was killed. A thrilled Washington wrote to his brother, "I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." That sound was the opening shot of the French and Indian War. His youthful confidence quickly slammed into the harsh reality of war. Soon after, he and his outnumbered men were surrounded at a shoddy outpost they called Fort Necessity. It was here Washington got his first taste of humiliation. He was forced to surrender. He even signed a document written in French which he couldn't read that had him admitting to the assassination of the French officer. The next year, serving as an aide to the British General Edward Braddock, he was part of a disastrous expedition that got ambushed and destroyed by a smaller French and Native American force. Braddock was killed. Washington himself had 2 horses shot out from under him, and his coat was pierced by 4 bullets. He somehow walked away without a scratch, showing incredible bravery even in a complete disaster. While the colonists saw him as a hero for his courage, the British leadership was not impressed, writing him off as a poor commander. These early years were a baptism by fire. They taught Washington brutal, invaluable lessons about strategy, the absolute importance of supply lines, and the massive gap between personal bravery and a tactical victory. When the American Revolution kicked off in 1775, Congress needed a commander for its new Continental Army. They turned to Washington. He was from Virginia, the largest colony, which helped unite everyone. And his experience in the French and Indian War, as messy as it was, made him one of the most seasoned American officers around. On June 19, 1775, the 43-year-old accepted the job. He was now in charge of a ragtag force of citizen soldiers about to face the most disciplined army in the world. His first strategy was almost his last. Believing he had to fight the British in a conventional European way, Washington made a critical, nearly fatal mistake defending New York City in 1776. He split his army, putting a huge chunk of it on Long Island, a terrible position where they could easily be cut off by the powerful British Royal Navy. The British General William Howe completely outmaneuvered him, flanked his army, and dealt him a devastating defeat. Washington's army was shattered, and he was forced into a desperate, humiliating retreat. It was a total debacle. For Washington, the loss of New York was the single greatest failure of his military career. The retreat across New Jersey that followed was the lowest point of the entire war. The Continental Army was on the verge of simply ceasing to exist. Morale was shot. Soldiers were hungry, badly equipped, and hadn't been paid. They were deserting in droves. Their contracts were up at the end of the year, and almost no one had a reason to stay. As Thomas Paine famously wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls." Washington hadn't just lost a city, he was losing his army and the entire revolution with it. The dream of independence was freezing to death in the winter of 1776. He had lost more battles than he'd won, and even his own supporters in Congress were starting to doubt him. How could he possibly turn this around? In the darkest moments, true leaders are revealed. Cornered, with his back against the icy Delaware River and the revolution flickering out, Washington made a decision that would define his legacy. He knew his army needed a victory, not just for strategy, but for its own survival. He cooked up a bold, almost reckless plan, a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey, on Christmas night, 1776, in the middle of a blinding blizzard. Washington led his men across the treacherous, ice-choked river. The conditions were horrific. The 9-mile march to Trenton was an ordeal through snow and sleet, but the gamble worked. At dawn on December 26th, the Continental Army fell upon the completely surprised Hessians. The battle was over in less than an hour. The Americans captured nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers and suffered almost no losses themselves. The victory at Trenton was more than just a military win. It was a massive psychological turning point. It reignited hope throughout the colonies and proved that the Continental Army, with Washington in command, could actually beat a professional European force. A week later, he did it again, brilliantly outsmarting General Cornwallis and hitting the British at Princeton. These two victories revived the dying spirit of the Revolution, convincing soldiers to re-enlist and reminding the world that the fight for American independence was far from over. Washington had learned from his mistakes. The disaster in New York taught him he couldn't beat the British at their own game. So he embraced a new strategy, a Fabian war of attrition and retreat. He realized he didn't have to win every battle. He just had to make sure he never lost his army. The Continental Army's survival was the revolution. This new resolve was pushed to its absolute limit during the winter of 1777-1778 at Valley Forge. After losing battles at Brandywine and Germantown, and with the British occupying the capital of Philadelphia, Washington led his exhausted army into winter quarters. Valley Forge wasn't a battle against soldiers. It was a struggle for survival against starvation, disease, and total despair. The conditions were nightmarish. An estimated 2,000 soldiers died from sickness, malnutrition, and exposure. Washington wrote that they had experienced little less than a famine in camp. Men marched without shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Facing mass desertions, Washington had to use harsh discipline just to hold the army together. And all the while, a political plot, the Conway Cabal, was brewing as some in the military, and Congress schemed to replace him. But it was in the hell of Valley Forge that Washington's leadership truly shone. He shared the hardships with his men, earning their unshakable loyalty. He relentlessly begged Congress for supplies. And, most importantly, he used the time to transform his ragtag bunch into a disciplined fighting force. He brought in the Prussian drill master Baron von Steuben, who taught the soldiers professional military tactics. He put Nathaniel Greene in charge of supplies, who completely turned around the disastrous situation. Washington was learning to delegate, to trust his officers, and to focus on the big picture. When the army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, it was a different animal. Smaller, yes, but tougher, better trained, and more unified. Then came the news of a formal alliance with France, which brought critical naval and military support, lifting their spirits even higher. The final masterstroke of Washington's military career came at Yorktown in 1781. For years he'd been obsessed with retaking New York City, but when he learned a large French fleet was sailing for the Chesapeake Bay, he saw a bigger opportunity. In a brilliant move, Washington ditched his New York plans and secretly marched his combined American and French army more than 400 miles south to Virginia. The move completely fooled the British. At Yorktown, Washington's grand strategy all came together. The French fleet blockaded the Chesapeake, cutting off any chance of escape or rescue for the British Army under General Cornwallis. Trapped by land and by sea, Cornwallis had no choice. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his entire army. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended the Revolutionary War and secured American independence. The general who started his command with a string of humiliating losses had, through sheer resilience and an incredible ability to adapt, defeated the world's greatest superpower. With the war won, George Washington did something that was perhaps his most revolutionary act. In a world where victorious generals usually seized power, he did the exact opposite. On December 23, 1783, he stood before Congress and resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief. He voluntarily gave up power, a stunning move that established the principle of civilian control over the military, a cornerstone of the new republic. He just wanted to go home to his farm at Mount Vernon and live a quiet life. But the nation he helped create was fragile. The Articles of Confederation were failing, and the country was falling apart. In 1787, he was called on again, this time to preside over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. His presence gave the whole thing a sense of legitimacy it desperately needed, and he was key in guiding the delegates toward a final agreement. Once the Constitution was ratified, there was only one person the American people wanted as their first president. Letters poured into Mount Vernon, begging him to accept the job. But Washington was deeply reluctant. He was filled with real anxiety, doubting he was up to the enormous task of running a country. He wrote to his friend Henry Knox about his fears, worried about his age, his lack of experience in government, and how fragile the American experiment was. He worried that taking the job would ruin the reputation he had earned, but driven by an unbreakable sense of duty, he once again answered the call. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States. He was unanimously elected, the only president in American history to ever do that. In his inaugural address, he admitted his anxieties and even said he wouldn't take a salary, showing his commitment to public service over personal gain. As president, Washington knew that everything he did would set an example for the future. He wasn't just leading a government, he was building one from the ground up. He created the cabinet, appointing brilliant but feuding minds like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, and somehow managed their rivalries. He backed Hamilton's financial plan, creating a national bank and assuming state debts, which put the new nation on solid economic footing. He showed federal law was boss, personally leading troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, and in foreign policy, he navigated the chaos of the French Revolution by declaring America neutral, protecting the young nation from getting dragged into another European war. He was a natural and dignified leader, but he never forgot the dangers of power. He carefully built the institutions of government, laying the cornerstone for the U.S. Capitol building and overseeing the plans for the new federal city that would one day have his name. He was a leader defined by integrity, fairness, and a deep respect for the republic he fought for. After 2 terms, Washington made his final, most lasting contribution to American democracy Once again, he chose to walk away from power, refusing to even be considered for a third term. In his farewell address of 1796, he offered his last piece of advice to the nation he loved. He warned against the dangers of political parties and urged Americans to value national unity above everything else. He also advised against permanent foreign alliances, a principle that would guide American foreign policy for more than a century. That peaceful transfer of power was his ultimate gift. It cemented the idea that in a republic, power belongs to the people, not to one person. It was the final act in his transformation from a general to a true statesman, the father of his country. George Washington's journey wasn't one of constant genius, but of incredible growth. He started as a commander making costly mistakes, leading a cause that seemed all but hopeless. But through resilience, humility, and an amazing ability to learn from his failures, he kept the revolution alive. He turned the desperation of crossing the Delaware and the agony of Valley Forge into the very foundations of victory. As president, his hesitation to lead and his ultimate willingness to give up power set the standard for what a leader in a republic should be. He was a man driven not by raw ambition, but by a deep and unwavering sense of duty. From a losing general to a legendary president, George Washington's life is proof that true greatness isn't the absence of failure, but the will to overcome it. If you enjoyed this story from American history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about the people who shaped our world. Let me know in the comments which historical leader you'd like to see covered next. Thanks for watching.